see me later for translations. It's cold in here, isn't it? Yeah. So we need to try and warm the place up. And as a result of it being 10 to 11, you'll be glad to know that I've sliced the last hour and a half off this sermon. So we'll just stick to the original 90 minutes that are left. So it's a new year and we're starting on a new theme. And it's a bit of a departure really from what we did in 2020. In that we're actually going to look at some of the Psalms. And the Psalms are very different from what we've done, really, where we've looked at very narrative passages, really, for the last 12 months. And so this is a bit of a departure, but I hope that you're going to enjoy it. One of the things I particularly like about something like this is it gives an awful lot of leeway to the individual preachers who are going to come and share to sort of find their own way very much. And I think we all benefit from that mixture of textures and perceptions, and it helps us all really just to reflect. But it's my job to sort of introduce the subject, and I've quite enjoyed putting this together. Though I will tell you that there are a range of reading material that you can read about on Psalms, and some of them are just frustratingly superficial, and some of them are mind-destroyingly heavy. And so it's obviously something that's been written about an awful lot. C.S. Lewis has done a really good book about the Psalms. I probably recommend that one to you. And I've read a couple of books about this that, I wouldn't recommend. Not that they weren't tremendously interesting, just that afterwards I kind of thought that was really interesting. What was all that about then? So it is one of those things. But we're going to look at Psalms. We're going to particularly look at Book 2 of the Psalms. And Psalms are the most quoted part of Old Testament in the New Testament. So Psalms are quoted more often than any other part of that. And therefore we have to conclude that in terms of the whole New Testament narrative, the New Covenant, the salvation in Jesus, the end of the law, and so on, the Psalms are a very significant forerunner to that, a very significant part. So although sometimes Psalms can be quite difficult to read, we've got to remember that they're really very sort of central. Jesus knew the Psalms, Jesus quoted the Psalms, and he clearly saw them as a central part, and yes, as prophetic, but also as good information. So, we've seen this. Peter uses them, Paul uses them. The writer to the Hebrews, whoever she was, also has written them and quoted Psalms. So these are very important. But it's a very long and complicated mixture. I don't know if you've noticed that, 150 Psalms. So let's just tell you a little bit about the book itself. So first of all, it's not one book. It's actually 5 books, and they're all put together as a collection. They're written over several hundred years and by quite a few different authors, quite a lot of whom are named. Several are anonymous. Some of them are a bit generic in their attribution, such as the sons of Asaph and the sons of Korah. So we don't actually know who they were, though we do know what family they belong to. Both of those are Levitical priest families. Now, it's likely that the 5 books of the Psalms were actually collections over different periods of time. So in other words, Book 1 was collated as a series of songs and poems separate, and then Book 2 was then collated and so on. See it as a sort of Songs of Fellowship, Book 1, and Songs of, and as a result, some of the good stuff keeps, and actually as a result, you will see 1 or 2 of the Psalms are actually repeated, almost word for word, and some sections of some previous Psalms are also repeated. And there's no harm in this, but it's very much tells us that this is an ongoing and growing tradition of songs, because they are mostly songs, together. So we actually have, Psalms of Fellowship, books 1 to 5, with some classics continuing all the way through. A bit like us, and It Is Well With Your Soul, what a great hymn that is. And its influence persists, even to the point where, as we know, with things like Amazing Grace and so on, that they are, even if the song isn't recreated, its themes continue and the song is quoted. There's a sort of reference. And we see this in the Psalms, and it's how it is. It's probably put together after the exile. So this is not a sort of publishing house where, what has David written this year? I can't wait for his latest album to come out. That's not actually how this has happened, but the songs have survived with, the verbal tradition, and they've become favorites, and then eventually somebody's written them down, a bit like a sort of folk collection, or alternatively, which is also quite possible, that the document survives, probably copied and copied, but it survives, and then they're all collated together, and that's what we end up with. The most likely thing is that all the Psalms are put together for use in the temple. And there's been quite a lot of discussion about this with people who don't particularly see God as being particularly special. So in other words, theology without God, if there is such a thing. And so it says, well, this is just yet another ancient religion with its various cult chants, trying to renew things like the other ancient religions in the region. But actually, this is not true, and close study shows that the Psalms are very, very different in their culture and in their texture and in their purpose. And I don't want to go into details, but just to say that this is not just ancient writing, but greater than that. Now, a little further about reading Psalms, if I may. So, the Judaistic style of poetry is quite earthy and frank and graphic and direct. And actually that's sort of very much what, sort of Judaistic language is. See it as the sort of, the sort of north of England of the religious world, really. Call a spade and not an agricultural implement. It's very much that. But don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean, therefore, that Psalms are clumsy or unsophisticated or crude. Quite the opposite. In fact, the Psalms are actually really rather sophisticated and rather clever. But they do have patterns. So a lot of the phrasing works in parallels. This is very much the style. So you'll notice in the Psalm we read, for example, that there'll be a statement and then it will be repeated sort of, but usually developed in one direction or another. So, save me, O God, by your name is the very first phrase, followed by vindicate me by your might, which is repeating it, but also developing it. What is David saying? Save me. Well, what is he actually saying? He's actually saying vindicate me, which actually means not just that he's in danger, but he's being accused of something. And he is developing this theory. Hear my prayer, O God, is the phrase. Then followed by listen to the words of my mouth. And this is very common, this sort of repeated phraseology. Sometimes in some psalms we see it for public. So we have that call and response, which we still do nowadays. In churches, and sometimes we even do it with psalms. And that tells you that psalms like that are very definitely for public use or public involvement. So there's this style. But there's also one of the interesting things is that the themes are very, very wide. So they go from a sort of communal, together, temple-based experience right through to very, very, very personal reflections. Some of them almost embarrassingly personal. Really, do you want to make that public? And that's quite an interesting range. And also, there are wide generalizations at times when people get, like we do, when we get very cross, you know what I mean? And we go, everybody's against me. What we actually mean is, they're annoying me. But it's become, everybody's against me. And we get this big generalized statements about the wicked without actually telling us who it is, because it doesn't matter. In the full flush of emotion, the person who's writing this is just generally outraged or feeling got at or so on. And we see this reflected in that, and that's quite good. And it's helpful because that's like what we're like, which is one of the great things about the Psalms. But there's quite a lot of things that we miss because it's translated into a different language. And, we benefit a lot, you individually and me individually, if we do a bit of research. So there are certain things. The Psalms are full of plays on words. In fact, the Old Testament's full of plays on words. And one of the things that Jesus did was he played a lot on words. There's a lot of wit in what Jesus says that is missed to us because it's kind of not there. There's a lot of cultural references which are well worth looking up because they have parallels in our culture. There are quite a lot of euphemisms. So some of the phrases and uses of phrases in the Psalms are a little bit naughty, touch on the racy side, but they're missed in our translations. They also use puns, and it's one of the things that I've had to learn. See, in Scotland, we don't really do puns in the sort of out-of-control way that English people do. And when I came down to England, I kind of couldn't understand why people laughed so much. Because you guys love puns. And actually, as time's gone on, not only have I feel the cold like a true southern softie, but I've actually learned to really appreciate puns. And I find them very funny now. But they're wasted up north because people just sort of roll their eyes. They don't then add another one, which is frankly hilarious, but you've really got to be down here to get it. And it's a bit like that in the Psalms. There's some cultural ways of humor and using words and so on that are well worth looking into. So we've got to learn to read the Psalms in lots and lots of different ways. And that's one of the interesting things. When I was a kid, I was in primary school in Scotland, and I had a primary school teacher called Mr. Warlock. And Mr. Warlock was an official in the Church of Scotland. And so we had to learn the Psalms from the Scottish Psalter. And the Scottish Psalter is a book of Psalms where things are sort of changed a bit to have rhythm. And the bottom line was that we learned these Psalms in primary school in a sort of monotone. You know what I mean? And we just droned away at the Psalms as each one did, and cursed the wicked and burned the babies and all of that. And that's what we did. And actually, that's completely the wrong way to read Psalms. We have to learn that there's whole ranges of texture, inflection, and so on in how things are said to bring them to life. But there's an important lesson in this, which is that not only are Psalms and other parts of Scripture not to be read and understood in a sort of monotone, but in fact, spirituality is not supposed to be that. We are not supposed to sort of achieve a sort of single point of, contentment or ecstasy or whatever, and the job is to stay there the whole time. Actually, one of the things that Psalm tells us is that life is a roller coaster. Yes, Psalms said it before Ronan Keating. Life is a roller coaster, and it ups and downs, and our relationship with God ebbs and flows as a result. If you want a sort of monotone point of passive contentment, that's Buddhism. That's not Christianity. We are real life, and the Psalms are real life. They show us our walk. There's a lot of talk about pilgrimage, particularly up to Zion or Jerusalem, but we know what that means in our Christian walk. It talks about the dangers, the snares, and the enemies. It talks about the temptations, money, sex, power, idleness, idolatry. It shows us our protection, talks about God as a shield and a protector, a guide, our strength. It shows us joy in the companionship with God and others, his love, the vindication that we receive. Now we know that's through Jesus. And of course, the joy of success as God comes through and actually does what he says. And it finally also, the Psalms tell us the destination, our eternal life and the perfect ongoing presence of God, which is what we aspire to. So all of these things are there. All of human life is there. And I really want to encourage you to participate in that. Quick word about the extremes in the Psalms, because there are some extremes. The language of the Psalms can sometimes be quite difficult. And what the psalmist, and it's not always David, but goodness knows he could be a bit bloodthirsty, are quite hard to take at times as well. And I want to point out three things about this. Number one is that the world in which the Psalms was written was brutal and fragile. So even if you were a king, and your life was somewhat cosseted in the ancient world, there was the likelihood that in a famine, you were just as likely, potentially, to die from a lack of food or a lack of supply as anybody else. Life was a lot more fragile than we are at all used to. Illnesses, there was no vaccines, antibiotics, any of that. Didn't matter who you were. Enemies would come in. And if enemies came in and invaded, man, it was not pleasant. You know, they didn't sort of shake your hand and just take your money. I mean, you were brutalized and so on. And even if you survived, it was a brutal world. And in fact, our Western world is very cosseted. We are a bit immune to this. In fact, we're more immune than we should be, because there's an awful lot of the world that is actually still like that. When I was doing some study in theology with the Baptist Union, I did a comparison about a drought that the world had in 2012. Did you know the world had a drought in 2012? Did you know that? No, you didn't, because we were costed. But there was a worldwide drought, and it caused huge hardship. And I did a study, and it was about how was the food supply disrupted in our country compared to East Africa. And I'll tell you how this worked. The food supply was disrupted in the UK by 3 hours because of this drought and subsequent food shortage. The food supply in places like Somalia was disrupted by 74 days. Now, there's the difference between our cosseted West and real-world East Africa, for example. So we look at everything through a very cosseted sort of place that we live. The Psalms is written in a much more brutal and actually real-world environment, if you like. And as such, we've got to understand that. Now, that doesn't therefore say that it's okay for all the mindless, bloodthirsty violence that the psalmist suggests. But we've also got to remember that these are not necessarily, what's the right way to put this? Meant. You know what I mean? When somebody gets really angry and they say, I wish you'd curl up and die, I mean, they've said it, but, you know, give them a couple of minutes and they mostly don't want you to curl up and die. But at the moment, well, they do. You know what I mean? Break their teeth, Lord, because they're saying bad things about me. You know, if somebody turned up with a pickaxe handle, they go, no, yeah, I was cross. In my heart, I meant it, and I'm sorry now because I don't really want you to break their teeth. But there was rage and there was anguish. And what I like about this is it's very real. I don't know, you probably don't ever get that cross. You probably don't ever go on the huge pity parties that some of the psalmists went, everybody's against me, if only I could curl up and die. Why was I born? I'm sure you never think any of those things ever. But one of the things we've got to remember, the context of the Psalms, is that it's honest. It's real. That's what people are saying in their hearts. And it doesn't necessarily mean that. Now, one of the things we need to learn from this is very important, because we are so incredibly British. And what it means to be British is this, is that we top slice and bottom slice our expressions. So when we're really, really, really outraged, we suck it all up and write an email. And if we are ecstatically joyful, we bottle it all up and grin a bit. And the Psalms doesn't do that. It doesn't top and bottom slice the emotion, the expression, the experience of life, including the experience of life with God. And what it gains, therefore, by being honest about all the hard and difficult emotions is all the exuberance and joy and, frankly, embarrassing to British people expression of knowing the wonderful presence of God and its involvement. And we would do well to learn this. But if you slice the bottom, almost inevitably you slice the top. And so the Psalms teaches us to not, but to be much more honest and real about what's going on. Now, that doesn't mean that we go around burdening everybody else with our bad day. Because remember, these are about talking to God rather than anybody else. But it is about, okay, going to God. I wish I was never born. I mean, God knows us very well, and he'll, treat us like the teenager we're behaving like. But it does us good to get it out there. You know what I mean? A sort of dose of spiritual hormones is it's still in there, isn't it? And the Psalms tell us to do this. So we don't edit them. Okay, so enough of why and what and how the Psalms are. What's the relevance of the Psalms to us today? And I'll just finish with these quickly. Number one, Psalms give us a revelation. They talk about human experience. And humans are humans are humans. So you're just as much like the people of ancient Israel as they are like us. In other words, almost identical. And you will see yourself in the Psalms. All the expressions of emotions are here. The extremes, the ponderings. I mean, I've talked about the extremes, but there's all the stuff in the middle, where people muse and wrestle with things and so on. They're all in there. It's great. The nature of God is in there. And we learn a lot about God's faithfulness and his grace and his promises and his hopes and his love and how he looks to pour it all out on us and how we make it difficult for him to do this. The nature of humankind is there. But also the prophetic hope of Jesus is there. One of the things we've got to remember about the Psalms is that they were written before Jesus came. They look forward, but there's no appreciation of freedom from the weight of the law. Genuine forgiveness of sins, permanent forgiveness of sins. This is not the context of the Psalms. It looks towards it, and you'll see that, but it never was the experience of those people. So we can take heart from that. But Psalms are also an expression. We see the anguish. We see the unbridled praise. We see the enthusiasm. We see the belief in God's promises and faithfulness. And we also see the doubts and the anxieties as well. We see them all. And the encouragement in the Psalms is don't bottle that up, but share it in real relationship with God. He can handle it. This is one of the things that we need to learn, is that God can handle it. If we go, Mark Gibbons, things that come out his mouth. Lord, I just wish that you'd cut his tongue out and break his teeth, because he's really irritated me today. And God goes, okay, Graeme, yeah, I'll do that. I know you're angry, sort yourself out, because he's my son and he's doing good. And I go, really? And we have to work it through, but that's real life. That's how it is. We need to have that with God. We need to learn to express ourselves honestly. And the Psalms give us a good example. So we get a revelation from Psalms. We also get expressions from Psalms, but we also get an example from them, that we can see this, how truths are worked out, how the musings actually follow through if we keep going with God. We understand God's priorities. Talks a lot about justice and faithfulness and loyalty and truthfulness, mercy, all these genuine values that God has. The Psalms tell us all of them. And we also see, like I said, and we read the revelation of Jesus. We see how God's plan that the people who wrote the Psalms couldn't actually see but hoped for really is absolutely fulfilled in Jesus. So that's great. So why are we studying it now? Well, we're going to study it for this reason. Humankind is the same as it ever was. So as we come into this year, which is a sort of post-COVID, we're all hoping, aren't we? Post-COVID 2021, what's it going to look like? It's worth reflecting in our relationship with God, what that can look like, and what we can do to come into 2021 and grow in a deeper and more real relationship with God, individually and together as church, both together. We can grow as individuals and learn to express with greater honesty our experiences and pray with more realism and less reserve. And I hope that as we learn to do that individually, that translates itself into when we get together. And yes, I'm looking forward to the time when we can get together. It's really nice to see all of you. You're all wearing masks, which means that 90% of what you say I can't hear because I read lips because I'm partly deaf. So I'm really looking to the end of face masks. I'm looking forward to us all meeting together. I like to get a hug, same as the next bloke. I don't want to get all gushy about it because clearly I'm pretending I don't care, but I do. I mean, these are all things that we want. But when we come together, we've got an opportunity to be church different from what we were before. We've got a chance to be church better than what we were before. We've got a chance to be church more real than we were before. And to be honest, I don't know about you, but I miss church. It was pretty good, and it was pretty real, and it was something that gave me joy. So, there's our opportunity. But we're particularly looking at this group, the Book 2, because in my view, it's got a wider range of expressions, and it's got a wider range of authors, and it's got a wider range of perspectives than the other 5. So that's the reason why I've looked at Book 2, because having range is a good thing. Listening to people that you don't agree with is no bad thing. You're not obliged to agree with somebody. Listening to somebody else's perspective can sometimes be uncomfortable, sometimes be challenging, sometimes be downright educational. But what we get in the Psalms is this whole range. And getting a range is no bad thing. And I'm hoping we're going to get a wider range again. In other words, I'm hoping that as a range of different people take a range of different Psalms and approach with a range of different perspectives, we all actually get things that we find uplifting, challenging, help us to grow, help us to develop. And that's really where we're on. And the texture and life of the Christian experiences encourages us to see God at work in everything, as the fantastic testimonies were that we saw. God is at work in everything, and that he is fulfilling his purposes in every single circumstance. And we can see that in the Psalms, that what the psalmists, and there were several of them, many of them, looked forward to, we now have. That we don't just have a hope of victory, we have victory itself in Jesus. There is no more to be done. There are no more sacrifices to be offered. There's no more earning. That was the labor of the people in the psalmist's time. It's been done. Jesus has paid the complete price. We don't have to do any more. We can't earn our salvation. So we can look at the frustration sometimes of the psalmists who struggled with this and realize, of course, that they were looking forward to a time when that no longer happened to be the case, and that the law was fulfilled, and vindication and righteousness came through Jesus, not by what we did, but through what he did. And that's a hope that we now walk in. So we don't just look forward to victory, we walk in victory itself. And if you want to know that victory, come to Jesus today And as you get to know Jesus, so your perspective on what the Word says shifts, changes, grows, and develops. And we see that it's okay to be us. We can be who we are, and God can handle it. And more than that, He can transform us to be more and more like Jesus. So I'm hoping we're going to enjoy this. We're going to enjoy the series, that we're going to learn a lot, we're going to grow a lot, and we're going to come out the other side of it different, more real, and more in love with God, who loves us so much. Thank you, and amen.